Hello, thanks for joining us here in Sydney. I'm standing outside the Sydney Museum of Contemporary Art, and I'm here to take a look at the photographic exhibition of the works of Erwin Blumenfeld. It's interesting to note that many consider that most of the best photographs ever taken were taken even before the introduction of colour. Well, technology's moved on, so I'd like to take the next few moments to show you how photographers can benefit from some of the advances being made in 3D content creation. But I don't want to concentrate on the technology. Instead, let's take a look at some of the well-established craft principles used in traditional photography and see how they might be best implemented in the production of a 3D image.
Photography and 3D content creation can seem a world apart. So how can you as a photographer use 3D as part of your workflow? Well, I can't say it's easy, but it is achievable. I'm Adrian Chaldecott and I'm a cinematographer and 3D illustrator.
The camera is the most important training tool available to a 3D artist. So as a photographer, you are already in a very good position to become a successful 3D illustrator. In fact, it's better than that, because in the world of 3D, some of the fundamental skills of photography can somewhat be overlooked. This is interesting because 3D programs do nothing other than you do as a photographer, albeit in a different way. So if that's the case, why use 3D at all? Well, 3D gives the visual artist a tremendous amount of control over the final output, enabling the post-production of art direction, as well as the ability to change lighting and materials, for example. On top of that, with the ever-increasing use of high-definition animated content designed for the use with portable devices, 3D lets you use a traditional skill whilst producing moving images and visual effects with all the advantages that brings. If you're new to 3D, learning such a comprehensive program as MODO could seem a bit daunting. But the good news is you don't have to know everything straight away. So if you hear me using terminology you don't quite understand, don't be put off, just concentrate on the overall workflow and hopefully you'll be one step closer to understanding the advantages of working with MODO. Let's take a look at this project and I'll endeavour to explain how this can be achieved.
Okay, so here we are inside of MODO, and I think you can see, even from this short sequence, that this might be a far more effective approach for use in electronic media than just a simple still. Now, this is an introduction into 3D for photographers who may have had little or no experience in this environment, so I don't want to spend too much time discussing the mechanics of modelling, but I do want to say that it's important to remember that models should be constructed as they're presented in the real world, and knowing how something is put together is fundamental. This has implications throughout the whole pipeline, because it's this that allows a texture artist, for example, to create functional textures, or an animator to move a model in places where joints may exist. So even with this relatively simple model, I have built it to real-world scale and in its constituent parts. This makes it much easier to lay on the textures, and if the model then needs to be animated, it can subsequently be done without reworking the entire model. We start off with a completely grey model with only the default lighting setup which MODO provides for us. The next task is to overlay our textures onto the model, and to do this we have to tell MODO where these textures reside in 3D space, and we do this through a process known as UV mapping. Most projects start off with modelling. MODO provides two tabs for this task. A model tab which shows a perspective view, and a model quad tab that shows a more traditional 3-point elevation alongside another perspective view. There are other tabs associated with UV mapping, animation and rendering amongst others. As we switch from one tab to another, the viewport changes, as does the display of available tools. So that when we switch back to the modelling tab, down the left hand side we can see another list of tabs containing tools specific to modelling, the deformation tab and the duplication tab. Equally, as we switch to the UV tab, we can now see displayed down the left hand side tools specifically used in the production of a UV map. And again, at this stage I don't want to go into the details as to how this map was produced, I just want to show you what this map looks like. This is essentially just a 2D representation of our 3D model. Producing this 2D representation can be a bit tricky at first, but just think of it as unfolding a box and deciding where to cut this box so that it can lie flat. Then consider how the textures might lie on the resulting pieces so that when it's all put back together again, it produces a coherent surface. The end sections of the breadboard are represented here in blue. It's not hard to see the outline or how this texture may be applied. You can see the 2D layout next to its 3D analogue. However, with more complicated shapes and organic objects, it can all become a bit confusing. As the complexity of the model increases, it soon becomes quite hard to identify which one of the UV islands belongs to which part of the model. I have around 50 UV islands, all of which have their own image maps associated with them. This will be duplicated for the 3 different skin layers and again for the bump and specularity channels, and as such I will eventually have in excess of 300 textures. So we have to find a way of managing this. This is where a texture painting application such as Mari comes in, one of MODO's sister applications. Whilst this can be done just as well natively within MODO, Mari has a particularly ingenious way of dealing with large texture assets. But before we start painting, let's take a look at some of the images I've shot in the studio of the asparagus. It's important that we have as clean and high-resolution images as possible. Remember, at this stage, we're not trying to make photographically pleasing images, we're just trying to get as much detail on the plate as we can. So as even a light as we can get is preferred, but if that isn't possible, Photoshop can help us out. But remember, we still want to get as much colour variation as we can, so go easy on the clone tool. An ultraviolet filter may help, as might some cross-polarisation. But if we're using a macro lens, the depth of field needs to be taken into consideration. An out of focus area on the plate will result in a low final quality image. Try and shoot more than you think you'll need, as much variation will really help sell the shot. Here we are in Mari, and I'm going to go through this very quickly as I'm confident that if you've had any experience in Photoshop, you'll have no trouble working your way through Mari. I've imported the untextured object from MODO and also the photographic plates that I took of the asparagus. Now all I have to do is drag whatever textures I require onto the model and start projecting them. It takes a while to get used to the navigation, but muscle memory soon takes over, and as you delve into the very powerful layering system, you quickly become able to perform quite complex tasks. Mari is one of those tools that is only limited by the artistic skill of the operator. I have now applied all the painted textures back onto the model in MODO. It may be worth explaining that the model in Mari is just a proxy of the actual model that still resides within MODO. That is, whilst I imported a copy of the model into Mari so it could be painted, all I have exported back into MODO is the paint alone. My final output from Mari is no more than a file of individual TIFFs which are associated with the UDIM. Basically, this means that MODO now knows where these textures reside in 3D space. So we now have a completely textured model ready for rendering. At this stage we could simply hit the render button and a technically correct image would result. This is akin to producing a snapshot, but to produce a high quality production image, more work is required. We now have at our disposal tools that exist only in the 3D world. Namely, we now have the ability to change the material settings so that they appear just as we want them. We can change colours as we might in Photoshop, but we can also change the way light interacts with the surface. We can change the reflectivity, the roughness and the transparency. We can even make materials luminous. It's here as a photographer you really get the chance to operate in your field of expertise. We have infinite possible ways of lighting the scene using many different methods. I'll try and cover as much as I can within the scope of this introduction, but just as in the real world, this is a vast subject. You will already be familiar with the basic principles, so let's just take a look at what each one of these lights is doing. Firstly, here's the perspective view of the lighting setup. You can see 3 lights. A soft area light, which is a key, coming from the front right, a rim light or kicker, which is coming from the back left, and an effects light, which is projecting light onto the wall. But there are 2 light sources we can't see. One is the wall itself. This has some luminosity which is built into the material covering it, and the other is a type of dome light. This is in fact a sphere that envelops the entire scene, and it is at an infinite distance from the subject, much like the physical sky. Projected onto the dome light is a spherical image, which not only produces light to light the scene, but also produces reflections. But for this image to produce sufficient light, it needs to be an HDRI, or a high dynamic range image. You may have already come across this type of image. It's not unlike a camera raw image, but it contains a much larger luminance range, many stops greater than we can see on the screen. This is a speeded up view of the final render. Let's take a few moments to remind ourselves of what the final shot looks like. I've rendered out the following frames from which I've taken screenshots. If I solo out the dome light or the environment light, it looks much like it would if the subject was just sitting in a room, which is exactly what's happening. This particular HDRI is the interior of a domestic open-plan room, much like the one we saw earlier. Again, as a photographer, you can easily produce your own HDRIs, as I have here. The key element is the high-definition component. There are quite a lot of free HDRIs available on the web, but low-quality HDRIs will produce noise that the renderer quite simply can't resolve. Using HDRIs to light was a big advance in CG lighting, but be aware that they have their limitations and they are no substitute for the skill of the photographer. With the key light soloed, we can see how it's illuminating the scene, and also the reflections of the light in the perspex shelf. If you look carefully, you can see the reflections of the key light in the droplets of condensation. The backlight is highlighting the subsurface scattering effect. This effect is clearly visible here, and you can see both the purple of the buds showing through the top skin layer and the glow of the stalk, which is the light travelling through the subject and scattering below the surface. Each time light hits the surface, it is either absorbed, giving us diffuse colour, reflected or refracted. What light isn't absorbed heads off in different directions in accordance with the roughness of that surface, if you like, surface scattering. In translucent materials that contain suspended particles such as milk or wine, the light travels from one suspended particle to another, generally losing energy as it does so and producing subsurface colour as a consequence. What isn't absorbed is again reflected or refracted until what little light is left eventually exits the material altogether. This scattering takes place beneath the surface, hence the term subsurface scattering. With human skin this also happens, and as the composition of the skin changes, so does the scattering effect. It is for this reason that when you see the skin shader, it is divided up into three distinct layers, the epidermis and the upper and lower dermis. There are numerous settings here which are related to the composition and geometry of the subject. This is one of the reasons why it is important to keep to real-world scale. Another is depth of field, the properties of which you will already be familiar with. The effect light is just producing a subtle variation on the back wall. The luminous material on the wall itself is also quite subtle, and its biggest contribution is the reflection in the timber. As you can see, this is all working as you would expect it to in the real world. You can use flags or gobos. You can add as many lights as you like. HDRI techniques can help to produce very sophisticated lighting setups, but they need to be treated with care. Hopefully you're getting a sense of how material creation and lighting are so interdependent. So with all this done, we can now go ahead and block out the camera moves, animate the lights, or indeed add visual effects. It is then time to hit the render button. In the first instance, if you just want to produce a single image, using the progressive renderer makes the job easy. Just hit the render button and you're ready to go. But for animation, speed is very important. Even for an experienced hand, this is to some extent a trial and error process. High quality settings will of course produce a high quality output. But without careful consideration of these settings, render times can become very long. Whittling away the seconds it takes for each frame to render can take many attempts, and it is inevitably a compromise. Even for the larger production houses, it is a balance between speed and quality. This is really an area where it is worthwhile taking the time to learn the correct procedures. Like everything else, it becomes easier with practice. Let's take another look at what this all looks like when it's all put together.
I hope that this has at least given you a glimpse into how 3D works and how you as a photographer can make a contribution to the process. This isn't an easy journey for anybody. 3D programs by their nature tend to be complex and multifaceted. But there are a number of ways that this journey was made easier for me. The Foundry has hours of free tutorials for the beginner as well as for the more advanced. There are also some excellent fee-paying tutorials available of a more specialist nature. There are many areas where this technology could be applied. I designed this building using it. MODO has opened many new opportunities for me, and I hope it can do the same for you. Thanks for watching the video. Anybody want to buy a bolt?
Easy, really. I think we got away with that.
Did we get away with that?